This is Miguel Falcão at miguelbase.com. You are listening to the Yes Music Podcast.
We're very pleased this week to welcome Derek Dearden onto the show. He is someone who is, as we will learn, intimately connected with Yes in the 1970s. So welcome, Derek.
Hello.
Great to have you here. And Mark is here with me as well. Hello, Mark.
Hello, everybody. How are you guys doing today?
Okay. Thank you very much.
Great. So, Derek, let's start off with the first question here. You worked at Advision in the 70s where Yes recorded some of its most important records. What was your role, and were you there for any of those iconic sessions?
I joined Advision in 1974, so it was after Yes were using it as a recording studio. They had previously changed over to using Chris Squire's studio at his house. While I was there, Alan came in to do the mixing for Ramshackled, his solo album.
Yeah.
And also Steve Howe was in for some of the sessions connected with his solo album. And that was when I first met the two of them.
Okay, fantastic. Well, you must have come across, though, people like Eddie Offord. Did you work with him, and what were your impressions?
Eddie Offord had left Advision by the time I arrived, but he did drop in and out of the place to see colleagues that he'd been working with. Of course, I met him a number of other times when he was working with Yes on recording sessions or on live shows subsequently.
Yeah.
And I also dropped in and saw him when he was living in Bearsville near Woodstock.
Right.
New York State, yeah.
How did you find him? Was he
He was pretty eccentric.
Pretty eccentric? Oh, right, okay. I know there's a story of him coming into Advision while they were recording Tomato in 1978 with a crow on his shoulder. Did you ever meet the crow?
I didn't know he'd done that at Advision. I seem to remember him coming around with a crow when I think he was recording the backing tracks for Going for the One.
Right.
Which was at the Townhouse Studios.
Yes.
And I guess that would have been about 1978, yeah.
Okay. Well, a couple of other people who are mentioned on the sleeve notes to Tomato, I was wondering if you knew them. There was Jeff Young and Nigel Luby.
Yeah, Jeff Young was probably nominally their senior engineer at the time I was working at Advision. And he was certainly recording the War of the Worlds mixdown with, I can't remember who the producer of that was, but of course Richard Burton was doing the narration.
Yes, yes.
And Paul Northfield was the other one that you mentioned. Well, Paul was actually a friend of mine, and it was Paul who tipped me off that there was a job going at Advision.
And what was your specific job when you got there?
Well, there were three of us working in the, I think it was called the maintenance workshop, but I mean, essentially we were responsible for making sure that all of the gear in the studio worked properly and the tape machines were lined up and that kind of thing. And also because there was a sister company called Felden Audio that had been importing a lot of audio equipment and selling it to other studios. They were still the main UK agents for Eventide. And so we also had to deal with all of the repair work for Eventide and various other franchises that they still had. I mean, incidentally, that was part of the reason why I was given the job, because I was able to tell them that I was a test engineer in a digital electronics factory, which was true. What I hadn't told them is I'd only been in the job about a month, and all the digital, and I'd been entirely analog up until that point, and all the digital electronics I knew I'd learnt in that month.
But this was the 70s. This was the start of digital electronics.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, well, the digital delay line from Eventide was one of the few digital pieces of equipment around. And, of course, the average audio engineer would open up the lid expecting to find half a dozen op amps and a few transistors and see two huge boards covered with small-scale integrated digital ICs.
A different world.
Yeah, different world indeed.
Hey, Mark?
So I was one of the few people in the country who could actually repair Eventide delay units.
Yeah.
Interesting. So the way we found out about your work was via the mention of Survival Projects Limited in several Yes concert programs.
Oh, amazing.
So when was that company established and what were its aims?
So that goes back to the time that, as I said, I was working at AdVision. I'd been there about 6 months. I'd learnt my way around a pretty wide range of studio equipment in that time. And Alan came in to do the mix down for Ramshackled. And do you know Nunu, who was his roadie for many years?
Yes.
While they were in, I spent quite a long time chatting with Nunu about various things, and he said that it was at the time when Alan had just bought the North drum kit with the sort of flared mouths.
Yes.
And Nunu said that they wanted to develop something electronic to go with the drums that would be novel and unique.
Yeah.
And would this be something I'd be interested in? So, like a shot, I obviously said yes, I would. and we knocked a few ideas around, and the upshot of that was that we had a few more conversations with Alan, and I put forward the ideas I'd got, and they liked the sound of them. So they made me an offer that basically they'd give me workshop space in the Yes Talbot Road warehouse, and that Alan would pay me a retainer to do the development along the lines that I outlined.
Right.
And Survival Projects was the company that initially was set up to commercially exploit that design if we got it to a state of fulfillment.
Right. Well, we're going to come back to the drum synthesizer in a minute. First of all, though, you said you had these workshops in Talbot Road, the famous equipment warehouse. What was it like in that environment? I mean, I'm assuming lots of people in and out, lots of famous people?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think all of the band dropped in from time to time, and various other people did as well. But it was really a social club for the roadies for all of the main rock bands of that era. So initially I had a very small workshop downstairs in a corner. There was a Chinese guy called Sam Lee who was a guitar specialist.
Yes.
Incredibly talented. And he looked after all of Steve Howe's guitars, which is how come he came to have a rather grander workshop upstairs with a sort of window out onto the main area. And after a couple of years or so, he just suddenly disappeared. Nobody absolutely knew what had happened to him or where he'd gone,
right,
or why. So I inherited that workshop space.
Right, yeah.
It was a funny place because in that little side street, about a couple of 100 yards from Portobello Road, in between a pub and an Indian grocer's shop, there was a steel roller shutter door that looked just like the entrance to a single car garage.
Right. Yeah.
And it was one of those doors with a sort of person-sized doorway inset in it.
Yes.
Which was the usual way in and out. And if you wanted to actually have vehicle access to it, that swung back on a big hinge, and then the roller shutter could be rolled up.
Right. Yeah.
But the funny thing is that when you went in, there was a sort of vehicle-size entranceway, and then it just opened out into a huge space. I mean, some people described it as the size of a bus garage. I think it would have been a pretty small bus garage, but that was where they built all the stage sets.
Yes, I was just about to say. Yeah, so those that Crab Nebula And all those things with Martin and Roger Dean were actually created in that space.
That's right, yeah.
Fantastic.
Amazing.
So when did you have the idea for the drum synthesizer for Alan?
Well, that came out of the conversations that Nuno and I had while Alan was doing the mixing at Advision. That was the initial thing, and then I went away and thought about it, and I sketched out some block diagrams, and I sketched out the way it would work. I think there was certainly a Moog drum at that time, which was not at all musical. But what we wanted to do is get away from the idea of having fake pads of any sort, and actually have real drums and pick each drum up with its dedicated microphone, and then feed the microphone signals in through a bunch of processors to produce something that would be musically coherent.
Right. But this was brand new technology, as we've already said.
It was totally novel.
Yeah.
And as far as I'm aware, nobody's done anything along the lines we were thinking of, and periodically I thought I'll have another go at it. Because, it was stretching the available technology of the time to the limit, whereas there would be a lot more scope. The basic idea was that according to the timbre of the way that the drums were played, it would select between one of four notes in a chord at any particular time. And then you'd have 5 drums, each playing notes of the same chord, but in a different register, so that you would actually generate polyphonic music that would make some kind of harmonic sense. And then, and then you could feed in a chord sequence using a keyboard. It was actually a modified mini Moog keyboard we had connected to it, and so you could progress through the chord sequence. So if you like, it'd be the equivalent of holding a chord on a guitar and finger picking round it, and then changing the chord and finger picking round that. Except there would be 5 of those going on at different pitches and with different voices.
Wow. That does sound a little bit like what Bill Bruford then did with the Simmons kits. Is that right?
Well, I believe so, but I think the Simmons were not real drums, were they? They were pads.
No, they weren't. No. So it was a combination of triggering and also the voices. So that you came up with the synth. You mentioned Moog, so it was playing Moog voices.
No, when I said the Moog keyboard, it was just the keyboard section out of a mini Moog, which we connected up to the circuitry to record the chord sequences. I had a voice generator for each of the 5 channels. I generated the actual frequencies of the notes from a top octave divider that then produced the 12 notes at the highest register, and then a bunch of divide by 2 counters to produce the same chromatic octave in each lower one. So they were all. It was a common circuitry in sort of electronic organs at the time. But it produced a bunch of square waves, and then a couple of octaves out of that would go to each of the 5 channels, and then pass through an envelope follower, which was triggered from the drums, and voltage controlled filters.
Nice. So I have this great concert video from the 1979 Philadelphia show, and I remember hearing this drum synthesizer in use on that. So how did this come over live, and how did it perform technically? This is one thing I'm very curious about, because in a live situation, was this a reliable unit? Was there any issues with it when he performed live with it?
The main problem that we had was spill from one drum to another. As I said, we had a microphone on each drum, and that fed into the channel that controlled it. But of course, if you had a nearby drum that was hit, that could easily get picked up and interfere with the signal from the first one. Certainly, we did some pretty impressive demos in the studio, not only with Alan, but we had various other people come and see it as well. I remember Arthur Brown coming round, the crazy world of Arthur Brown.
Yes, yes.
Incidentally, I've met him several times more recently. I did a couple of firework displays at parties where he'd done a full set culminating with the God of Hellfire piece to climax with, and then he'd lead the countdown into the show. But he came round with his drummer of the time and had a listen to it. I remember him sitting in a chair, laughing his head off and slapping his thighs. He really appreciated it. And there was a black drummer called Charlie Charles. I think he was with Ian Drury in the Blockheads, but I might have my wires crossed there. He came round and gave it a go. He certainly was impressed. The trouble with Alan was he was tremendously busy in all sorts of directions and rushing off. It was very difficult to actually get hold of him and get him to do nearly as much of the evaluation as I went through the development as I had been hoping. But, we got the thing completed. He did use it. I remember we took it out to Switzerland when they were recording the album in Montreux.
Yeah.
I don't know whether it actually appeared in any of those sessions. I didn't actually know until you told me that they had actually used it on tour. I don't think I saw that 1979 tour.
Because I was going to ask about that, because since you're just aware of it now, I guess my question might be kind of moot, but I'll ask it anyways, just from a technical point. Because you're getting the sound through microphones, do you think that stage volume might have also been an issue? Because Chris Squire was notoriously loud bass player. Yeah. Would his sound entering the drum mics have any issue with this?
Well, it could have done, but I think Alan only used it when he was doing the solo. So
okay.
So that wouldn't have been a problem. I think if I did the same thing now, of course, miniature microphones have come up enormously in quality since those days. If I was doing a similar thing now, I'd have the microphone internally and the connection brought out through the air balancing hole, which would probably improve that. Yeah.
Mm. So this wasn't your last technical marvel that you came up with. What other sorts of devices have you created, and for whom?
Let's see. There were lots. I mean, essentially, after we'd been running for a while, and Alan realised that if he was playing this retainer with a potentially infinite span into the future, that maybe we needed to make some other arrangement, which was why we extended the scope of survival projects to develop essentially sort of custom equipment on request, but also a few items that we developed in a speculative way, and some of which were reasonably successful.
So Paul Northfield, you've mentioned him a few times, went on to be one of the most successful producers on this planet. Did you always think that he had that kind of star quality? Well,
we were friends, and a good deal of the time around then we were actually sharing a flat together in London. So, but I knew he was very talented. I also knew that he was very driven, and he'd actually... he was probably the most junior person on Advision's staff at the time I was there, and he was just beginning to get engineering roles, if you like, rather than assistant or tape op roles. So I didn't actually doubt that he would. But obviously, none of us at that time could have imagined the scale of his success. Mm. He was actually the best man at my wedding.
Right.
Oh, nice.
Excellent.
And it was shortly after then that he got the offer of the job at Morin Heights and emigrated to Canada.
Yeah, and the rest of that is history, as they say.
Yeah. Getting back to some of the other things, for instance, I built a unit for Gentle Giant. Ray, the bass player, also played electric violin. And he wanted a kind of upmarket Echoplex style delay unit, which would have a quadraphonic output, and so that he could play his electric violin into it, and then a short while later, the phrase would be repeated from one of from side speakers in the auditorium.
Yes.
And he would play along with that, and then it would move round to the back with what he'd been accompanying with it, playing to the right, and it would go right round the auditorium.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that was very successful. Probably one of the most impressive developments came out of Brian May's roadie dropping in at the warehouse and having a chat with me, and he said that Brian was using an Eventide harmonizer, pitch shifter, and he wanted to be able to control it from a pedal, but the only pedal facility that came standard with the machine was one that simply continuously bent the pitch shift up and down.
Right.
And what Brian wanted was 8 specific intervals so that he could operate the pedal to, if you like, play an arpeggio accompanying what he was playing on the guitar.
Yeah.
And so I developed that. And he was very pleased with it. He was so pleased he came back at the end of the first tour and said he'd like to buy another one.
Is that what he used for his amazing solos that he used to play?
He certainly was using it in his solos.
Goodness me, yeah.
That would have been 77 or so.
Yeah. That fits. Absolutely.
We went to see them at Wembley. And then I built a more elaborate version of the same thing with a lot more options for what particular selection of notes you could choose, which Steve Howe bought.
Nice.
And I think Nigel Luby bought one as well. Nigel also bought one of my panners. At his request, I modified his so that he could control the panning speed from a pedal optionally rather than from the front panel.
Right.
Let's see, Dave Gilmore bought one of those as well.
But I do want to ask you about one thing that you haven't mentioned yet, and that is, can you explain what the mega filter is and how it's used?
Okay, so the mega filter is something that I came up with in conversation with Paul Northfield, actually. And I think the first version of it I built in about 2014. I mean, essentially, it's just a very versatile voltage-controlled filter with literally millions of possible combinations of settings, so that you can obviously vary the frequency and you can obviously vary the resonance, and you can do that either by setting the knobs on the unit, and you can then modify that by the operation of an expression pedal plugged into it. And the expression pedal can either modulate the frequency or modulate the resonance or modulate the wet-dry mix of it or modulate the speed of the LFO. And then you can mix in an LFO or an envelope into it. So effectively it gives you a sort of fairly full range of analog synth effects, but with any particular signal as a starting point. Mostly that's guitars, but it could be a piano, it could be anything else.
So was this specifically geared for studio use, or was it specifically made for like a guitar player or a keyboard player?
That was specifically for a performer.
Okay.
But obviously, one could go in a studio. I mean, I produced a stereo rack mount variation of it.
Right. And this device is available today?
It's available today. It hasn't been an enormous commercial success, partly because it's, in this day and age, sort of running something like this as literally a cottage industry is pretty uphill work. And of course, Brexit didn't help. And then the COVID lockdown, wiped out a lot of musical activity for a couple of years. So so it's been basically on ice.
Yeah.
That harmonizer control unit that I described about, I produced a variation of that for John Anderson, which connected into a string synthesizer that he had. And this enabled the entire keyboard of the synthesizer to be transposed up or down by a series of intervals. And I remember playing around with this once I'd got it working. I mean, we basically took the master oscillator signal out of it, fed it through my unit, and then fed it back in to drive the dividers that generated the intervals of the whole keyboard. And
Right.
I remember I was holding down chords and playing and rocking the pedal backwards and forwards, and roadies were coming going, Derek, I didn't know you could play the keyboard. But and then, of course, cracked up laughing when they saw my fingers weren't moving. But so there was that one. And then there were several things I did for Rick Wakeman. One of them was a signal processing unit for a set of piano pickups he had. I don't know whether you know whether the name Helping still means anything. I don't think they're used much these days, but it was a way of getting the sounds out of a grand piano,
Yeah.
apart from simply putting a couple of microphones under the lid.
Yes. Yeah.
And they were if you like very long guitar pickups that were suspended from a bridge across, each of them covering, an octave and a half or so of the strings. And so there were 5 of these covering the whole range of the piano.
Yes.
And I made up a rack unit which had 5 parametric equalizers. So by feeding them through there, again, it was sort of very similar to the effect you get on a VCF on a synthesizer. So Rick could be playing the piano, and then he'd kick this in, and the piano would suddenly sound much more like a synthesizer.
Wow.
And the other thing, Rick had believe it or not, a chamber organ,
Yes.
a pipe organ, which they actually took on the road. I think mainly for that organ section in close to the edge.
Yes. Yeah.
So there was one box which giant flat case with all the pipes in it. There was another pretty big flat case with the compressor and the bellows in it, and another one with the console.
Yes.
And then there was a gigantic 128-way multi-core cable to connect the console to the to the organ, which was out of the back of the stage.
Right.
And his roadie came and said, is there any way that you can... because the cable weighed over 100 weight, I should think.
Yeah.
And he said, is there any way you can do this? So I said, yeah, I think I could probably do something that sent all the signals from the keys down a bit of coaxial cable.
Right.
And then decode at the other end and trigger the relays that open the pipes, which we did. So, that would have been, I guess, 77 or 78. And in a way, I kind of, I guess it was a sort of precursor to the MIDI connection, because at that time there was no way of sending serial data from a keyboard to a tone generator. I mean, all of the synths of that era were integrated.
So you were a pioneer and also a bit of a wizard, fixing the problems of some of the live situations and studio situations.
Yeah. And then after I left that, I was asked to assist. I don't know if you know of the lighting company called Avo Lights.
Right, yeah.
But they asked me whether I could develop a computerized lighting control console for them, which I did. I thought it was going to take 3 months. It actually took 3 years. And it was very annoying because they had a rival called Selco who got a computerized lighting console of some sort out.
Yes.
And everybody said, well, we hear that Avo Lights is developing one and we want to see what that's like before we decide to buy it.
Yes.
And we eventually did get it out. It had its debut on the Michael Jackson World Tour, either 83 or 84.
Yeah.
And it absolutely wiped the floor with the competition. And,
Yes.
And we, and in fact, it became the standard rock concert for all the major tours for the next 12 years or so.
Yeah.
Including the Live Aid concerts on both sides of the Atlantic.
Oh, nice.
That's a brilliant claim to fame, isn't it? Well, listen, Derek, that's been absolutely fascinating to hear your stories and your explanations of what you did for the drums and musicians. So thank you very much indeed for coming to speak to us.
Okay, it's my pleasure.